Okay, so we're going to continue reading The Kite Runner. We'll continue on page 148 where we left off yesterday. I tried to upload last session on SMS. I don't know if it's going to let me because of the video in it, but I just wanted to let you know. But the link to see the video is in SMS. Okay, so if you remember the last, yesterday when we stopped reading last, there was a group of men that had come to Atticus's home, okay, and they were very angry. So much so that finally Jim had to shout, Atticus, the telephone's ringing, because he was afraid that these men were about to do something to Atticus, okay? Selma, can you read for us, please?
Yes, Muslim.
Okay. If you have any questions while she reads, wait until she's finished and we'll answer your questions. Okay, go ahead, Selma.
The men jumped a little and scattered. They were people we saw every day, merchants in town, farmers. Dr. Reynolds was there, so was Mr. Avery. Well, answer it, son, called Atticus. Laughter broke them up when Atticus switched on the overhead light in the living room. He found Jem at the window, pale except for the vivid mark of the screen on his nose. Why on earth are you all sitting in the dark? He asked. Jem watched him go to the chair and pick up the evening paper. I sometimes think that Atticus subjected every crisis of his life to tranquil evaluation behind the mobile register. The bring the
Birmingham.
The Birmingham News and the Montgomery Advertiser. They were after you, weren't they? Jim went to him. They wanted to get you, didn't they? Atticus lowered the paper and gazed at Jim. What have you been reading? He asked. Then he said gently, No, son. Those were our friends. It wasn't a gang. Jim was looking from the corners of his eyes. Atticus tried to stifle a smile, but didn't make it. No, we don't have mobs and that nonsense in Maycomb. I have never heard of a gang in Maycomb. Ku Klux got after some Catholics one time. Never heard of any Catholics in Maycomb either, said Atticus. You're confusing that with something else. Way back about 1920 there was a clan, but it was a political organization more than anything. Besides, they couldn't find anybody to scare. They paraded by Mr. Sam Levy's house one night, but Sam just stood on his porch and told them things had come to a pretty pass. He told them the very sheets on their backs. Sam made them so ashamed of themselves they went away. The Levy family met all criteria for being fine folks. They did the best they could with the sense they had, and they had been living on the same plot of ground in Maycomb of 5 generations. The Ku Klux Gun, said Atticus. It'll never come back. I walked home with Dell and returned in time to overhear Atticus saying to Auntie, in favor of Southern womanhood as much as anybody, but not for preserving polite fiction at the expense of human life. A pronouncement that made me suspect they had been fusing again.
Fussing.
I saw Jem and found I saw Jem and found him in his room on the bed, deep into night. Have they been at it? I asked. Sort of. She won't let him alone about Tom Robinson. She almost said Atticus was disgracing the family. Scout, I'm scared. Scared what? Scared about Atticus. Somebody might hurt him. Jim preferred to remain mysterious. All he would say to my questions was go and on and leave him alone. Next day was Sunday. In the interval between Sunday school and church, when the congregation stretched its legs, I saw Atticus standing in the yard with another knot of men. Mr. Hickdate was present, and I wondered if he had seen the light. He never went to church. Even Mr. Underwood was there. Mr. Underwood had to use for many organizations, but the Makeup Tribune, of which he was the sole owner, editor, and printer. His days were spent at his linotype, where he refreshed himself occasionally from uh, an ever-present gallon jug of cherry wine. He rarely gathered news. People brought it to him. It was said that he made up every edition um, of the Maycomb Tribune out of his own head and wrote it down on the linotype. This was believable. Something must have been up to hold Mr. Underwood out.
Okay,
I
Selma,
caught
thank you.
Atticus
That's
coming
good,
in the
baby.
door and
That's good. Thank you. All right, does anyone have any questions about what Selma just read? Okay, it's mainly here talking about Mr. Underwood that owns the newspaper, the Macomb Tribune, for which he is the owner, editor, and printer. And that's about all he ever thinks about. It does say, he does say, however, that some of his days he refreshed himself with a jug of cherry wine. Okay, so that means he drinks a lot. It also says that he rarely gathered the news, that people brought him the news. All right, so let's continue reading here. Adam, would you read for us, please?
Okay, miss. The fake peace that prevailed on Sundays was more irritating by Aunt Alexandra's presence. Atticus was free to his office directly after dinner, where if we sometimes looked on him, we would find him sitting back in his swivel chair reading. Aunt Alexandra composed herself for a 2 hour nap and dared us to make any noise in the yard. The neighborhood was resting. Jim, in his old age, had taken to his room with a stack of football magazines, so Dill and I spent our Sundays creeping around in deer pasture. Shooting on Sundays was prohibited, so Dill and I kicked Jim's football around the pasture for a while, which was no fun. Dill asked if I'd like to have a poke at Boo Radley. I said I didn't think it'd be nice to bother him and spend the rest of the afternoon filling Dill on last winter's events. He was considerably impressed. He parted at supper time, and after our meal, Jim and I were settling down to a routine evening. When Atticus did something that interested us, he came into the living room carrying a long electrical extension cord. There was a light bulb on the end. I'm going out for a while, he said. You folks will be in bed when I come back, so I'll say good night now. With that, he put his hat on and went out the back door. He's taking the car, said Jim. Our father had a few peculiarities.
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 Yes, that means
One
strange
was
habits.
One was he never ate desserts. Another was that he liked to walk. As far back as I could remember, there was a Chevrolet in excellent condition in the car house, and Atticus put many miles on it in business trips. But in Mecomb, he walked to and from his office 4 times a day, covering about 2 miles. He said his only exercise was walking. In Mecomb, if one went for a walk with no different purpose in mind, it was correct to believe one's mind incapable of definite purpose. Later on, I bade my aunt and brother good night and was well into a book when I heard Jim rattling around in his room. His go-to bed noises were so familiar to me that I knocked on his door. Why ain't you going to bed? I'm going downtown for a while. He was changing his pants. Why, it's almost 10 o'clock, Jim. He knew it, but he was going anyway. Then I'm going with you. If you see you're not, I'm going anyway. Here, Jim saw that he would have to fight me to keep me home. I suppose he thought a fight would antagonize Auntie, so he gave in with a little grace. I dressed quickly. We waited until Auntie's light went out, and we walked quietly down the back steps. There was no moonlight. Didn't want to come. I whispered, so he will, said Jim gloomily. We leaped over the driveway wall, cut through Miss Rachel's side yard, and went to Dale's window. Jim whistled Bob White. Dale's face appeared in the screen, disappeared, and 5 minutes later he unhooked the screen and crawled out. An old campaigner. He didn't speak until we were on the sidewalk. What's up? Jim's got the look around. Affliction, Calpurnia said all the boys caught at his age. I've just got this feeling, Jim said, just this feeling. We went by Mrs. Dubos's house, standing empty and shuttered, her camellias growing up in weeds and Johnson grass. There were 8 more houses to the post office corner. A south side of the square was deserted. Giant monkey puzzle brushes bristled on each corner, and between them an iron hitching reel glistened under the street dark. A larger square of stores surrounded the courthouse square. Dim lights burned from deep within them. Atticus's office Atticus's office was in the courthouse when he began his law practice, but after several years of it, he moved to quieter quarters in Mecomb Bank building. When we rounded the corner of the square, we saw the bar parked in front of the bank. He's in there, said Jim. But he wasn't. His office was reached by a long hallway. Looking down the hall, we should have seen Atticus French attorney at law in small sober letters against the light from behind his door. It was dark. Jim peered in the bank door to make sure. He turned the knob. The door was locked. Let's go up the street. Maybe he's visiting Mr. Underwood. Mr. Underwood not only ran the Mecom Tribune office, he lived in it. That is above it. He covered the courthouse and jailhouse news simply by looking out his upstairs window. The office building was on the northwest corner of the square, and to reach it, we had to pass the jail.
Okay,
The Mecom jail,
Adam, that's good. Thank you, baby.
yes,
Can you summarize what you read for us?
okay. At first, they told us about things that Atticus didn't do, like he never ate a dessert, he always loved to walk. He had a Chevrolet parked in his garage, but he never used it except only for business trips. And then one night he went out and told them that he would be back when they're at bed, so he told them good night. And then when they went all to bed, Scout heard strange noises from Jim's room, and she was sure that this weren't Jim's go to sleep noises. When she knocked on the door, she realized that he was changing his clothes and he was about to go downtown. She told him that she will go with him. At first, he refused, but when he thought about fighting here would annoy Aunt Alexandra, he agreed. And then Dale joined them on the way. While they were walking, they found the bank where Atticus's new office is, and they described how Mr. Underwood collected news about the courthouse and the jail news, and all what he did is simply look out his upstairs window.
Okay, thank you, Adam.
You're welcome, Miss Lynn.
All right, Bamika, will you read, please?
Yes, Miss Tan, can you just show me from where should I continue?
Right here.
One second. The Maycomb J was the most vulnerable and hideous of the country's buildings. Atticus said it was like something Joshua
St. Clair.
Clair might have designed. St. Clair. It was certainly someone's dream, starkly out of place in a town of square-faced doors and steep-roofed houses. The Maycomb jail was a miniature Gothic joke, one cell wide and two cells high, complete with tiny battlements and flying buttresses. Its fantasy was heightened by its red brick, decayed and the thick steel bars at its ecclesiastical windows. It stood on no lonely hill, but was wedged between Tyndall's hardware store and the Maycomb's Tribune office. The J was Maycomb's only conversation piece. Its detractors said it looked like a Victorian privy. Its supporters said it gave the town a good, solid, respectable look. And no stranger would ever suspect that it was full of niggers. As we walked up the sidewalk, we saw a solitary light burning in the distance. That's funny, said Jim. Jail doesn't have an outside light. Looks like it's over the door, said Dill. A long extension cord ran between the bars of a second floor window and down the side of the building. In the light from its bare bulb, Atticus was sitting propped against the front door. He was sitting in one of his office chairs, and he was reading, oblivious of night bugs dancing over his head. I made to run. Jim caught me. Don't go to him, he said. He might not like it. He's all right. Let's go home. I just want to see where he was. We were taking a shortcut across the square where four dusty cars came in from the Meridian Highway, moving slowly in a line. They went around the square, past the bank building, and stopped in front of the jail. Nobody got out. We saw Atticus look up from his newspaper. He closed it, folded it deliberately, dropped it in his lap, and pushed his hat to the back of his head. He seemed to be expecting them. Come on, whispered Jim. We streaked across the street, until we were in a shelter of jitney jungle door. Jim peeked up the sidewalk. We can get closer, he said. He ran to Tyndall's hardware door. Near enough, at the same time discreet. In ones and twos, Men got out of their cars. Shadows became substances as lights revealed solid shapes moving toward the jail door. Shadows, Atticus remained where he was. The men hid him from view. He in there, Mr. Finch, a man said. He is, we heard Atticus answer. And he's asleep. Don't wake him up. In obedience to my father, there followed what I later realized sickeningly comic aspect of an unfunny situation. The men talked in near whispers. You know what we want, another man said. Get aside from the door, Mr. Finch. You can turn around and go home again, Walter. Atticus said pleasantly. Heck, take around somewhere. The hell he is, said another man. Heck's bunched so deep in the woods they won't get out till morning. Indeed, why so? Called him off on a snipe hunt, was the succinct answer. Didn't you think didn't you think that Mr. Finch? Thought about it, but didn't believe it. Well then my father's voice was still the same. That changes things, doesn't it? It though another deep voice said its owner was a shadow. Do you really think so? This was the second time I heard Atticus ask that question in 2 days, and it meant somebody's man would get jumped. This was too good to miss. I broke away from Jim and ran as fast as I could to Atticus. Jim shrinked and tried to catch me, but I had a lead on him and Bill. I pushed my way through the dark, smelly bodies and burned into the circle of light. Hey, Atticus! I thought he would have a fine surprise, but his face killed my joy. A flash of plain fear was going out of his eyes, but returned when Dill and Jim wriggled into the light. There was a smell of stale whiskey and pigpen about, and when I glanced around, I discovered that these men were strangers. They were not the people I saw last night. Hot embarrassment shot through me. I had leaped triumphantly into a ring of people I had never seen before. Atticus got up from his chair, but he was moving slowly, like an old man. He put the newspaper down very carefully, adjusting its creases with lingering fingers. They were trembling a little. Go home, Jim, he said. Take Scout and Bill home. We were accustomed to prompt, if not always cheerful, acquiescence to
Equisense.
Atticus, acquiescence to Atticus' instructions. But from the way he stood, Jim was not thinking of budging. Go home, I said. Jim shook his head. As Atticus' fist went to his hips, so did Jim's, and as they faced each other, I could see little resemblance between them. Jim's soft brown hair and eyes, his oval face and snug fitting ears with our mother's, contrasting oddly with Atticus's graying black hair and square cut features. But they were somehow alike. Mutual defiance made them alike. Son, I said, go home. Jim shook his head. I'll send them home, a burly man said, and grabbed Jim roughly by the collar. He yanked Jim nearly off his feet. Don't you touch him, I said the man swiftly, barefooted. I was surprised to see him fall back in real pain. I intended to kick his shin, but aimed too high. That'll do, Scout. Atticus put his hand on my shoulder. Don't kick folks, he he said, and I was pleading justification. Ain't nobody gonna do Jim that way, I said. All right, Mr. Finch, get him out of here. Someone growled. You got 15 seconds to get him out of here. In the midst of strange assembly, Atticus stood trying to make Jim mind him. I ain't going, was steady answer to Atticus's threats, requests, and finally, please, Jim, take them home. I was getting a bit of tired of that, but felt Jim had his own reasons for doing as he did. In view of prospects, once Atticus did get him home, I looked around the crowd. It was a summer night, but the men were dressed, most of them, in overalls and denim shirts buttoned to the collars. I thought they would be cold natured, and their sleeves were unrolled and buttoned at the cuffs. Some wore hats pulled firmly down over their ears. They were sullen looking, sleepy eyed men who seemed unused to late hours. I sought once more for a familiar face, and at the center of the semicircle I found one.
Okay, Bamika, thank you, baby.
You're welcome.
All right, Bamika, when they finally found Atticus, and then the 4 cars of men drove up, what were the 4 cars of men planning on doing?
They were planning on hitting them on the men.
But what were they there to do? Does anybody know?
I'm not sure.
They were there to take Tom Robinson out of the jail.
Okay.
Okay, everyone know that? They were there to get Tom Robinson out of the jail. Okay, they mean harm to him. All right, Hannah Haney, would you read, please?
Yes, miss, of course. Miss, from
Yes.
where we will start because we must.
Right here. Remember, Scout? She says
Okay.
right here in this paragraph that these were not the same men that she had seen last night. This was a different group. And she says that they were all dressed in overalls and denim shirts. Some wore hats, some were sullen looking, some were sleepy. And then she started looking around for a familiar face. And all of a sudden she finds one right here, Hannah.
Okay. Hey, Mr. Cunningham. The man did not hear me, it seemed. Hey, Mr. Cunningham, how's your entitlement getting along? Mr. Walter Cunningham's legal affairs were well known to me. Atticus had once described them at length. The big man blinked and hooked his thumbs in his overall straps. He seemed uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and looked away. My friendly overture had fallen flat. Mr. Cunningham wore no hat, and the top half of his forehead was white in contrast to his sun-scored face, which led me to believe that he wore one most days. He shifted his feet, clad in heavy work shoes. Don't you remember me, Mr. Cunningham? I'm Jean Louise Finch. You brought us some hickory nuts one time, remember? I began to sense the fruity one feels when unacknowledged by a chance acquaintance. I go to school with Walter. I began again. He's your boy, ain't he? Ain't he, sir? Mr. Cunningham was moved to a faint nod. He did know me, after all. He's in my grade, I said, and he does write well. He's a good boy, I added. A real nice boy. We brought him home for dinner one time. Maybe he told you about me. I beat him up one time, but he was real nice about it. Tell him hey for me, won't you? Atticus had said it was the polite thing to talk to people about what they were interested in, not about what you were interested in. Mr. Cunningham displayed no interest in his son, so I tackled his entailment once more in a last-ditch effort. to make him feel at home. Entitlements are bad, I was advising him, when I slowly awoke to the fact that I was addressing the entire aggregation. The men were all looking at me. Some had their mouths half open. Atticus had stopped poking at Jim. They were standing together beside Dill. Their attention amounted to fascination. Atticus' mouth even was half open, an attitude he had once described as an uncuff. Our eyes met and he shut it. Well, Atticus, I was just saying to Mr. Cunningham that entitlements are bad, and all that, but you are said not to worry. It takes a long time, sometimes, that you'll ride it out together. I was slowly drying up, wondering the idiocy I have committed. Entitlements seemed all right enough for living room talk. I began to talk sweet, gathering at the edges of my hair. I could stand anything but a bunch of people looking at me. They were quite still. What's the matter? I asked. Atticus said nothing. I looked around up and up at Mr. Cunningham, whose face was equally impassive. Then he did a peculiar thing. He squatted down and took me by both shoulders. I'll tell him you said hey, little lady, he said. Then he straightened up and waved a big paw. Let's clear out, he called. Let's get going, boys. As they had come, in ones and twos, the men shuffled back to their ramshackle cars. Doors slammed, engines scuffed, and they were gone. I turned to Atticus, but Atticus had gone to the jail and was leaning against it with his face to the wall. I went to him and pulled his sleeve. Can we go home now? He nodded, produced his handkerchief, gave his face a going over, and blew his nose violently. Mr. Finch? A soft, husky voice came from the darkness above. They gone. Atticus stepped back and looked up. They have gone, he said. Get some sleep, Tom. They won't bother you anymore. From a different direction, another voice cut crisply through the night. You are damned tootin' they not. They won't. Had they covered all the time, Atticus? Mr. Underwood and a double-barreled shotgun were leaning out his window above the Macomb Tribune office.
Okay, Hannah, stop there, baby. Thank you. Now, summarize, tell us what was going on and what you read.
Okay, what I understood that there were men standing waiting for Tom Robinson, and Scout was there, was talking with Mr. Cunningham, but he didn't talk to her back. And then they went and they left the place, and Atticus made sure that they left to tell Tom Robinson that he can sleep and relax.
Okay, let me add a few more points here. All right, as we said before, this group of men are there to force Tom Robinson and take him out of the jail because they want to do harm to him because they think he's guilty. So Scout is very smart. She thinks to herself that she should do something to try to break this up so there will not be any trouble. So she goes up and starts talking to Mr. Cunningham. And as Hannah said in the beginning, he would not talk to her. So she started talking to him about his son, telling him that he was her schoolmate. She had beat him up one time, but he was still nice about it, even after she had beaten him up, okay? Well, she still could see that didn't do any good. So she started talking about his entailments, which are legal problems. Remember at the beginning of the novel, we found out that this family is very poor. And when they couldn't pay their legal bills or any bills with money, they would pay them by giving hickory nuts or some items like that. So she reminded Mr. Cunningham of this. She said when she started talking about his entailments, and that she didn't think entailments were good, okay? And he still didn't act like he was going to talk to her. So all of a sudden, she starts telling Atticus that she was just saying to Mr. Cunningham about entailments, all right? But she's thinking to herself, what other idiot ideas had she committed there in front of all these people? She could feel herself starting to sweat, okay? And she said, I could stand anything but a bunch of people looking at me. And they were all very quiet and still. And she asked what was the matter, but Atticus didn't answer. But all of a sudden, when she asked what was the matter, Mr. Cunningham come to her and said, I'll tell him you said, hey, little lady. So at this time, we know that Mr. Cunningham realized that what they were doing there was wrong. So he ordered all of them to load up in their cars and leave, okay? So she turns to Atticus, and Atticus had gone to the jail and was leaning against the wall. And a soft voice said, Mr. Finch, they gone? And Atticus told him, it was Tom Robinson. Atticus told him, yes, they've gone. Go get some sleep. They won't bother you anymore. And all of a sudden, a voice says, you're damn tootin', they won't. I had you covered the whole time, Atticus. And when they turned around and looked, it was Mr. Underwood with a double-barrel shotgun. He was there to help Atticus. Okay, any questions? Okay, Hannah, yes, Yasser, will you read, please?
Yes, of course. It was long past my bedtime and I was growing quite tired. It seemed that Atticus and Mr. Underwood would talk for the rest of the night. Mr. Underwood out the window and Atticus up at him. Finally, Atticus returned, switched off the light above the jail door, and picked up his chair. Can I carry it for you, Mr. Finch? Asked Dill. He had not said a word the whole time. Why, thank you, son. Walking toward the office, Dill and I fell into step behind Atticus and Jim. Dill was encumbered by the chair, and his pace was slower. Atticus and Jim were well ahead of us, and I assumed that Atticus was giving him hell for not going home. But I was wrong. As they passed under a streetlight, Atticus reached out and massaged Jim's hair. Massaged Jim's hair. His one gesture of affection.
Okay, Hannah, we'll have to stop, baby, because we only have like 20 seconds left. So I don't want to start
Yes.
chapter 16, but tomorrow you can begin with chapter 16. The last paragraph,
Yes, thank you.
just summarize here.